Hello and welcome to our Green Municipal Aggregation webinar today. My name is Daria Mark and I'm here with Larry Cushion. We'll talk about aggregation and all the different aspects, but first I want to do a few housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded and I will send a copy of the recording along with the PDF of the slides to you after the webinar within a day or two. We will also post the webinar to our YouTube channel where we have some other webinars available on EVs and other topics. In your GoToWebinar panel, you will see at the very top an orange box with an arrow, which you can use to expand or contract that panel. In that panel is also a question bar, which we encourage you to use to send the questions. We will answer the questions in the question bar by typing the responses back, but it will also address a lot of the questions at the end when we save some time to address the more common and pressing. If we do not get a chance to answer your questions, depending on the timing of the webinar and how many questions we receive, we will reply back to you. I promise you that we will get all the questions answered. So please do submit, and we'll take a short pause at each agenda slide to remind you to go to that question panel and submit your questions. If my sound is good and you have a chance and you've found that question bar, if you could give me a quick shout out by saying, yep, sounds great, I can hear you well, that would be really helpful and welcome. And now I hand it over to Larry Cushion.
Hi, thank you, Daria, and thank you everybody for participating in our webinar on Green Municipal Aggregation. I'm the Executive Director of Green Energy Consumers Alliance, and Daria is doing a great job on community outreach as we try to explain how aggregation is working in a lot of communities in Massachusetts and how it can continue to work, and we hope that we can add some communities to the roster that is now adopting the model that we helped develop. Could advance the slide, Daria. Our organization is a nonprofit organization that was founded way back in 1982. Our mission is to harness the power of energy consumers to speed the transition to a low carbon future. In almost everything we do, we try to run a program that you as a consumer can tap into and help make a good energy solution for yourself so that you can reduce your carbon footprint and possibly even save money at the same time. While we do that with the programs, we also take the opportunity to try to figure out what kind of public policies can be better developed that would change the energy system on a larger scale. And in particular, we focus on state policy and also local policy. We have offices in Boston and Providence, so we do a lot of work in the state houses in both places. When we look for policies, we look for policies that are pro-consumer and pro-environment. And over the years, our aggregation has developed into our biggest program, and that's what we're going to try to get into today. If you could advance the slide. Back in February, a few of us, particularly Daria, wrote the second edition of our report, the Green Municipal Aggregation in Massachusetts. We did the first edition, of course, back in 2018, and you can go to our website after this webinar and you can read the whole report. It's a pretty quick read if you want to learn more about what's going on, and you can look up your community and see where it stands. But today we're going to try to walk through it and try to bring it to life in about 1 hour. The main point I want to make, and we say this in the report, is that the report is from our perspective as an organization that's actively engaged in green municipal aggregation. We know most about the communities that we're working with in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. We're trying to provide detail on those communities, but we also try to develop a map, so you see what's going on throughout the state, and we try to be as accurate as possible. If there's something about your community or about the map that you see that maybe we didn't get exactly right, we'd be happy to hear from you, and we do try to update it as time goes on. With that, I'll turn it over to Daria, and she'll present the report.
Great. Thank you, Larry. So we'll talk about a couple of things today. We'll first go through electricity aggregation, how the program works, and some of the basics. Then we'll talk about the types of aggregation programs that we support. Then we'll talk about a bigger picture of what's going on at the state level with green municipal aggregation. We'll go through some of the greenwashing that can happen in electricity purchases, making sure that when you clean electricity, you're buying electricity that makes a difference. And then we'll go through the next step, choosing to bring, interested in bringing aggregation to your city or town. What are the next steps? How do you get this program moving? So green municipal aggregation is built upon the concept of municipal aggregation, which allows a city or town in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to take charge of their electricity, to choose a supplier. And by doing that, the green portion can be added. We can say that we can add more renewables to the mix of electricity above and beyond what the state requires. So communities can start with 5%, 10%. It's up to the community. Brookline started at 25% and has increased now in their second aggregation contract to 30%. And other communities have started at 5 and increased to 10. So that's a common pattern that we see where a community can start at a level that feels comfortable to them, and as people become happier and more familiar with the program, they can make an even bigger impact. So why is green municipal aggregation so important? First of all, it gives you immediate greenhouse gas reductions, because by adding renewable electricity, you're displacing the fossil fuels in your electricity mix. And also, because aggregation programs run for 2 to 3 years, you're providing a multi-year support for renewable electricity generation. And that really builds on itself and helps support the kind of projects that we need in our New England grid. So aggregation programs start in this typical format of having this big circle group where almost everyone in the city or town winds up being. It's anyone who was on the utility, so National Grid or Eversource, anyone who was on that utility's basic service winds up being in the default rate. So when I said that we add, we typically start by adding 5% or 10% to the green municipal aggregation programs, that's above and beyond what the state requires. And that additional default rate is where most people wind up. Then we also set up an opportunity for people to opt up. So that's for those folks who want to say, well, 5% is not enough for me, 10% additional is not enough for me. I want my whole home to be powered with 100% renewables. And so you could still do that within the pre-negotiated and vetted price of your green municipal aggregation, also known as Community Choice Aggregation, or even Community Choice Electricity Aggregation Program. These are all synonymous. There's also still inside the program, the GMA program, is the opt down to 0%. Now that's not 0% renewable electricity total, that's just 0% above what the state minimum is. And we know that the state minimum is not enough for us to meet our goals and targets in 2030 or in 2050 for the emissions that we need to, but that's where you wind up if you go to that 0%. So there's also, the program does not penalize you for leaving. Aggregation programs allow you could choose a competitive supplier. You can come back in from a competitive supplier into the aggregation program also. So you just have to check the terms of your competitive supply agreement, but there is no penalty for joining the Community Choice Aggregation Program or the Green Municipal Aggregation Program. And the same applies to those folks who are on utility basic service. So if you were not part of the utility basic service at the time when your aggregation program started, or something had not happened for you to be part of that default start, then you could also always join into the aggregation program, and you can also opt out. There is no penalty. So for those who are thinking about how does this structurally work, what are the different players that are involved in bringing aggregations forward? The decision always starts with your community. So your community, as a town or a city, a group of advocates, whatever group you have, decides we want to start green municipal aggregation. So we're going to work on this, from the left to the right. So the community has decided we want to start aggregation. If you're a town, that's a warrant article that needs to be passed. If you're a city council resolution. So once those two things are done, either of those two things is done, you'll need to find an energy broker. So we work with energy broker called Good Energy, and we supplied the green portion to all their aggregations. And we've worked with them since 2015. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we cover the programs that we support right now. So once you've hired an energy broker, say it's Good Energy, then Good Energy will guide you through the process. You need to make a plan for your aggregation. That plan needs to be developed in coordination with the Department of Energy Resources. Then the plan needs to be submitted to the Department of Public Utilities, excuse me. And so the energy broker is working on all those things with you as a town, with the community's input on how you want this program to be run. And then once you've gotten approved by the Department of Public Utilities, you're good to go. You can now start your aggregation program. And in order to start your aggregation program, you need to find an electricity supplier. We call it here the competitive supplier, who's going to provide the supply for your whole town, for anybody who's going to go into that default circle that we just talked about. So the competitive supplier will provide two things. They'll give you the physical electricity, and then they'll give you the renewable energy certificates to meet the state standard. So that's this year, we have two different standards that we're under now, and that's 20% electricity. So that's what the competitive supplier takes care of. And then that's where the additional green electricity is where we come in. So we are Green Energy Consumers Alliance, and we provide the renewable energy certificates to meet your additional requirements. So if you're saying we're going to start with 5%, that's the 5% of your total load that we'll provide. If you start with 10%, we provide 10% of the total load. So whatever additional green electricity that you would like for your community to have, we are there to supply it. So for those, many people might be familiar with renewable energy certificates, but just in case you're not, this is how how renewable electricity is traded. There's no way for me to get an electron that was generated from a wind turbine and get it to your house if you decide you're going to buy renewable electricity. Electrons are separate from this mechanism that we have called renewable energy certificates, or RECs, as you'll often hear them called. We only buy Class 1 RECs, which means that they are approved in Massachusetts to comply. I had talked about the two standards we have that make up 20% of our electricity that has to come from renewables. And those RECs, one REC equals 1 megawatt hour of electricity, or 1,000 kilowatt hours of renewable energy that has been generated. So a windmill spins, it puts electrons on the grid, and once it's spun 1,000 kilowatt hours of electrons, it gets one REC certificate, and that's can be traded. The developer who built that wind turbine can sell that REC independently from the electrons that they're generating. And wind is just one example. Solar, hydro, digester gas, among others, are eligible for this Class 1 designation. They have to be built after, the facilities have to be built after 1997. Average homes use about 7 RECs per year. Obviously, that depends on the electricity you're using and if you have air conditioning and central air conditioning, et cetera. But give or take, that's about an average. And so I've already mentioned that this is a market. This lets us trade renewable electricity to do things like say, well, we want to add more renewable electricity to a house, or in the case of Green Municipal Aggregation, for the residents and small business owners of the whole town or city. All right, so we'll take a quick pause here. If you have any questions about RECs or aggregation in general, please take a moment and write your question in the questions panel. I see a couple of people gave me a shout out and my sound is good, so that's great. I'm glad you could hear me. And so if you have any questions, please keep them coming. You can add your questions at any time. So now we'll talk a little bit about the types of aggregation programs that we support, we at Green Energy Consumers Alliance. So we have the town of Dedham and Melrose, which you'll see on the next slide, which started with us in 2016 and are still continuing their aggregations. This is a snapshot I did when we wrote the report in February, and so you can see the contract lengths of the different towns. And as I mentioned, aggregations typically run between 2 and 3 years. That seems to be a sweet spot for buying electricity ahead of time, and so that gives you a better chance at a better price. So if you want to read more about the programs we support, let me echo back the report that we have at greenenergyconsumers.org/aggregation. That the report is 43 pages. It has a 3.5, 4-page executive summary. So depending on how much time you have available, we go into a lot more detail about aggregation programs, the lessons we've learned, things we can take away, where we see this going forward. So that's a really great opportunity to learn a lot more about green municipal aggregation. And so you could see Brookline just started. I had mentioned Brookline before because they started at such a high percentage of 25%. Now they increased in their second aggregation contract, they went to 30%. Arlington went from 5 to 11% in their second aggregation contract. Bedford just started their aggregation, that is their first, and they started at 5%. Dedham just is going to finish their aggregation at the beginning of next year. We'll go from there with them. Then there's Gloucester and Hamilton. Oh, there we go, there are the slides. And then we have Medford, also just launched. Melrose was one of our original towns that we started with in 2016. They're on their third aggregation contract. Somerville just renewed from 5 to 10% also. Rockland started, Stoneham, Sudbury, Winchester just renewed. They started at 5% and they went to 10%. So we really love to see towns start at a place that's comfortable for them, get people familiar and comfortable with the program, and then increase the percentages so they can make more of an impact. Here's another view on the savings that we've been able to see. Now, I just want to put a quick disclaimer that no one can predict the future. So I cannot tell you that we will absolutely guarantee any kind of savings, but this is what we have seen. This has been the cumulative amount of savings that these 5 townships that I was able to pull out from the data we have, that we're able to see realize these savings through the end of December 2019. So even though some of their aggregations didn't necessarily end in December 2019, but these were the savings that they were able to achieve at the percentages that they started with. So this is the saving in comparison to the utility basic service. So if you stayed on utility basic service, you would have paid, Somerville would have paid $5 million, some more than they did because Somerville started their aggregation program. So that's what this chart says, that even though we're adding renewable electricity to the aggregations in these towns, we are providing a savings to the small business owners and to the residents of towns. So this is really a strong program that's absolutely a win-win for everyone, both for our climate goals and for the renewable energy we're able to bring on, and for the consumers. So here's another view. As I mentioned, Dedham is a community that we had from the very beginning. That's why we have this great stretch of data with them. So you could see that the utility price, which is the orange line here, changes every 6 months. And the aggregation price, which is the solid green line at the bottom, that is the price for the default. Dedham was 5% for their first contract and 5% for their second contract. And then you could see the 100% opt-up price. As I mentioned when I talked about the structure of aggregation programs, we always give people a choice to go above and beyond what the default is to the 100% pre-negotiated price still within that green aggregation program. And some towns have even now started adding a 50% choice also. So Arlington, for example, has the default price that most everyone winds up to. And then some people have chosen to go to 50%, gone all the way to 100. And then people always have the choice to opt out if they really want to. But what you could take away from this chart is that even there are times when the 100% the 100% clean electricity price is still below some of the 6-month stretches of utility price. So you can the end of the first contract and all the second contract is so far has been below the utility price. So we've been really providing a savings for the residents and small business owners in Dedham. Brookline, I wanted to show this again because Brookline started at such a high percentage and has even increased that. So even at 25%, Brookline's rate for aggregation was still below most orders compared to the utility basic price. These are the sources where we get our renewable energy certificates. You could see there's a mix of hydro and solar and wind and digester gas. And we look for projects that will specifically make a difference in the Massachusetts and New England electric grid. Look to build a local project, and I'll talk a little bit about that, of why it specifically makes a difference to build locally and not national projects. There's another aspect, even though Green Municipal Aggregation, as we call also Community Choice Aggregation, even though it has the word municipal in it, it does not apply to the municipal electricity. So municipal electricity is the stuff you buy to power the lights on in town hall or city hall or schools or fire department, any of the things that are owned by the government of your municipality. That's electricity there too, and that is at the if you do nothing, that is at the state required minimum. But municipalities can also go into long-term contracts and also put their thumb on the scale to increase the amount of renewables that are in the mix, and they can either match their aggregation programs. So let's say a town adds 5% additional, the municipality could add that 5% additional in their own electricity, or they can even go above and beyond what their aggregation is doing. And that's that's really important by setting example and saying these things are important to us. We are concerned about climate change. We're concerned about how our electricity is generated, concerned about burning fossil fuels, and therefore we're making these choices. So this is another thing that we get a lot of questions on. How can we use aggregation to support the basic green municipal aggregation that we've talked about? How can we use that aggregation to support long-term contracts? So a sweet spot for a developer is give or take 10 years. But aggregation programs at best run 3 years. So in this case, I've shown an example of what happens when you have a 3-year long aggregation, but you would like to use that aggregation to support a project and a long-term 10-year contract. So the time shows that in each year of your aggregation, you would collect a third of the funds that you'd need to cover the total project cost. And then so that was your first year. In the second year, you collect another third, and then your last year, you'd collect the last third. And then in the first year, when the project starts operating, you're able to start paying out a tenth. And so the rest of the funds can stay in escrow, and as the years roll by, you will every year distribute a tenth of the project in rec sales out to that developer who has built the project to deliver clean electricity. All right, so we'll take another short break, and if you have any questions, I know I just covered a lot of information. So if you have any questions, please take a minute, find the question bar in your GoToWebinar panel and type your questions into us. We are happy to answer them, and it really helps us to address any of the different aspects of aggregation that may be of interest to you. All right, thank you. And next we'll go talk about the status of green municipal aggregation in Massachusetts. We put together this map that really gives an overview of how the different towns and cities in Massachusetts have progressed with aggregation. So we'll start with the deepest green. The deepest greens are those towns and cities that have gone above 30%, above or equal to 30% of additional Class 1 renewable content. And then the less green the shading is, the less the percentages, all the way down to barely green at all in those communities that are buying only 1% of their load. That's the Cape Lake Compact and a town in Western Mass. And so that's the green scale. And you could see that when we talk about green municipal aggregation, please remember in 2016 when we started this, there were 2 green dots. Cape Flood Compact was already there and they were doing their work. But for the rest of the communities, there were only 2 other places, Melrose and Dedham, that were adding 5% renewables. So in the last 3-4 years, we've changed this map dramatically. And this, just to be clear, these are not aggregations that are only done by Good Energy with us supplying the green recs. This is what we know based on websites and the research that we can do for the whole state. So there's other brokers that are doing these aggregations. So this is not just our work. This is what we see as a kind of snapshot of what is happening in Massachusetts. And what's also really interesting to notice is all the blue shading. The blue shading is in process. Now that means they've either formed an aggregation committee and they are in the process of hiring a broker. As I mentioned, you hire someone like Good Energy that would then steer you through the rest of the process. So that's step one. Or they have already hired a broker and they've already gone to the Department of Public Utilities, but they're just waiting. The Department of Public Utilities takes now over a year to approve aggregation programs. And that was before the COVID-19 crisis. So then, or some of these municipalities are already approved for aggregation programs, but they're still in that zone of where they've already been approved, but they need to still go out and get a competitive supplier and then launch their aggregation. There's also an required opt-out period before an aggregation can be launched. So they're either in any one of these 3 bins. But as you look at this picture, you can see just how many communities are in that process, how aggregation has really taken off. And not all of these communities will add to our green shades, but a lot of them will. And so that is really making a difference in the way we in Massachusetts are sourcing our electricity. And then there's 2 more colors here. There's the light brown and the dark brown. Light brown means that a community has no additional default renewable electricity, but they give the residents an option and small businesses an option to go to 100%. Unless there's a concerted effort on the part of the municipality or advocates or someone in that town to really get people signed up, those numbers tend to be really low. And then the dark brown communities are those that not only they don't add default, but they also don't even have an 100% opt-up choice. They are just doing municipal aggregation to provide a savings and price stability. Oop, excuse me. So we talked a little bit about that aggregation makes an impact, but what kind of impact? So we've done the numbers, and if you look, remember what the previous slide looks like, where we talk about what is happening in Massachusetts. If we take those communities that are already doing aggregation, and especially green aggregation, and then we add those communities that are in progress to aggregation, we estimate that by 2022, we'll have 500,000 megawatt hours per year in voluntary additional REC purchases to supply to those aggregations. So the communities that are there now, plus the in progress communities, gives you 500,000 megawatt hours. That's a huge impact. If we also look at those numbers, but we follow those communities that have, like Somerville, like Arlington, like Brookline, have started at a certain percentage, but have increased it since, we are up to 700,000 megawatt hours per year. That's additional, and we call it voluntary because these communities are choosing to make this impact, choosing to create this additional demand. So that's REC purchases. And then if you take an average wind turbine in New England, that's around 200 wind turbines worth of extra demand that is generated by the renewable, by the green municipal aggregations, by the renewable energy that these communities are adding. And that's huge. That's a really big impact onto our electric grid that would not exist there if we were not doing these aggregation programs. There's a secondary benefit to aggregation. As we know that we have to transition our transportation out of being driven by fossil fuels to electricity, right? We have to get into the EV zone. We have to get our cars, our vehicles, our trucks to be driving on electricity. Well, how that electricity is sourced makes a difference. And we have 4 lines here. The line that's at the very bottom is the Brookline type ask. If you're taking what the Massachusetts state law requires, and you're adding 30% additional renewable resources, by 2035, you've gotten to 0 grams of CO2 emissions per mile driven. So that's our goal, right? We know that by 2030 we have to reduce our emissions substantially. We know that by 2050 we have to get to 0, and we need to get there not just in our electricity, but we also need to get it in other places. And so this is how transportation stacks up. So 30% is the green line, 10% is the blue line. 30%, the red line is the Massachusetts Basic Service, and the purple line is the Rhode Island Basic Service, which you can see plateaus at 2035. The other place where we have to get rid of fossil fuels is heating and cooling. The cooling is, of course, already done by electricity, but how do we get our heating out of oil and gas? Pretty much half of the state heats on oil, the other half, give or take, heats on gas, and then there's like a tiny sliver of those who are heating on electricity. Well, we need that sliver to take over the other 2 sources. We need homes to transition out of burning fossil fuels as their primary heating source to using electricity. And the heat pumps are the solution to that. They've been used in Europe for far longer than here, and now the adoption is starting to pick up here. And there's 4 different programs in the state that support the adoption. There's Heat Smart, Mass CC has incentives, Mass Save has incentives, and then if you want to do a really deep dive into your house and really make it really energy efficient, the Home MVP program is also another source of those incentives. All right, so we'll take another short break. I've talked about the where we are with Green Municipal Aggregation in the state and the benefits that are available there. And then we'll talk about what things to look out for. Where could the pitfalls come from in buying renewable energy? So take a moment. If you have any more questions, please go to the question panel and we'll keep answering them, and then we'll return to a lot of your questions at the end of the webinar. So be careful of greenwashing, because not all aggregation programs are created equally. When we set up an aggregation program, our goal is by buying renewable electricity to incentivize the development of more renewable electricity. This is called additionality, that what you're doing provides additional renewable electricity. So the Massachusetts Class 1 RECs that we buy provide that additionality because they are generated in the state where we have our electricity. And the more of those Class 1 RECs we take off the market, the fewer there are available. And the fewer there are available, the more the other people who have to buy those Class 1 RECs need to go in and find more developers to create more of those Class 1 RECs. So if you're buying either Class 2 or if you're buying national wind RECs, that does not have the same impact. There are great projects being built in really sparsely populated areas of other states that have excellent wind potential that will do absolutely nothing to change the way the electric grid in Massachusetts and in New England operates. What we need to do is we need to displace our natural gas power plants. You know, we still have a little bit of coal in our mix, we still have a little bit of oil, but most of our electricity generation that's fossil fuel driven is now natural gas, and we need to displace that. That's the methane that's leaking in pipes and that's going to the power plants and then is being released as carbon dioxide. So what we need to do is, instead of that electricity, we need renewable electricity. And so if you're buying Massachusetts Class 1 RECs, that's what that does. It incentivizes more development of the kind of resources, solar, wind, and hydro and digester gas that we can use in Massachusetts to generate the clean electricity, and in New England also. Anything outside the New England area, however great that project might sound, it will not displace the natural gas generation that is happening here. And that's what we need to do. There's a second aspect to this, and this is about as kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum of aggregation. So aggregation goes through a long vetted process through the Department of Energy Resources and Department of Public Utilities to make sure that the energy broker you've selected has set up an excellent aggregation program that is transparent and that is really consumer friendly, and that the rates stay stable, et cetera. So that's aggregation. And then there's individual competitive suppliers. So that's the people who are going to reach out to you either with a phone call or with a letter, and they're going to make it sound like their electricity is absolutely amazing at an incredibly low price that beats the basic service from the utilities. And then what often happens is that that price changes, and that price often changes without notification to you. And so the Attorney General has been extremely worried about this for a long time. And so in 2018, she commissioned a report to study how much of an issue this is. In 2019, she has done an update, and based on those two reports, the 3-year loss to consumers is $253 million. So whereas aggregation programs save consumers money, competitive suppliers that pick off people one at a time are losing them money in compared to basic service. That's how much extra funds people paid more and above and beyond what they would have had to pay had they stayed on utility basic service. And so this is of deep concern, especially because elderly and communities of color are really much more impacted by this. They are more likely to buy into these competitive suppliers thinking that they're getting a great deal. So this is in no way should be confused with aggregation. This is absolutely the opposite end of the spectrum. All right, so let's go over the next steps. If you have any more, I see a lot of great questions coming in. I really appreciate it. Please keep them coming as you'd like. If you have something we didn't cover and you'd like to clarify, please type it into the question bar.
Daria, hi. Could
Yeah,
I chime in to answer a couple questions that people have asked?
sure.
Okay. One question was, and there's two related questions. One question was, um, is it possible with all this aggregation plus the state standards that we'll have enough renewable energy to meet the demand? And the answer is yes. There have been numerous studies counting up what they call the technical potential of renewable energy in New England, and that also the economic potential. And the availability or the potential capacity that we could have far exceeds what our needs would be through 2050. And that means primarily means a lot more offshore wind. And we really need that in order to meet our climate goals. So what we're talking about today is about creating demand for resources other than offshore wind, but that'll come eventually and will become very important. I can imagine about 5 years from now, many of the communities that are doing aggregation will be engaged with one or more offshore wind projects. And then, so I think it's important to keep that in mind, that we are trying to hasten demand for renewable energy, but we're confident that we'll be able to build enough wind turbines and enough solar panels and other resources that are necessary. Another question was that we may have confused people a little bit with, we quoted the fact that we think that by 2022, the demand created by aggregation will be equivalent to that of about 200 wind turbines. And then we talk about megawatts of capacity versus megawatt hours. And so what happened when we talk about the capacity of a wind turbine, a large scale wind turbine is approximately 2 megawatts in capacity, meaning that it's when it's able to churn out the most power, its fullest capacity is at 2 megawatts. It doesn't usually run that much at 2 megawatts. it has to be, the wind conditions have to be just right. But when you run a 2 megawatt wind turbine over the course of a year, it generates about 8,000 or 9,000 megawatt hours, which is that's the energy it actually produces. And so that's why we shift a little bit from talking about megawatts to megawatt hours. Another question was wanted to know more about how we promote these programs, such as opting up to 100% in cities and towns. Daria, do you want to speak to that? You've been very active in your own community of Brookline, but we have other communities like Somerville that have done a great job in Arlington.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to address that. So, opt-up is a wonderful thing. It gives people an opportunity to go above and beyond of what the default has been set for their aggregation program, and it's still, in case of the programs we support, in still providing that additionality in the recs they're buying. So the things we've seen is communities will choose based on what feels right to them, different methods. For example, we could send a flyer to the residents and say, you know, here's an aggregation program that you have, here's an opportunity to go 100% above what the state requires. So then that's one. The other thing we've done in Brookline that I think has been really effective is setting up outside lawn signs. And this is especially important. And if you've read the research that shows how much neighbors look at what the other neighbors are doing, you could see the effect of that is that we see, you know, sometimes there'll be one sign that goes out and then a couple more will go out. And then once that street has 3 or 4 signs, then people can't help but notice that there is something that is that this has been adopted by this community. And that's where we could see the numbers really change when people start seeing others giving that legitimacy to the program, and so then signing up on their own. We find that doing a couple of different things really helps. So we could send a physical flyer, we could send emails out through the, most towns have a climate group of some kind or an energy board or some kind of advocacy group that is interested in making a change in the footprint. So sending emails out through those and posting to social media at different times and repeating the message also I find really helps. Sometimes we forget that not everyone has seen our message the first time, and so repeating the message of opt up, opt up, opt up on a monthly basis or even a quarterly basis and running campaigns repeatedly really helps to get the numbers up. So putting out lawn signs, flyers, people have done, if there's kiosks like, like Blue Bikes or such, or sometimes bus stations have kiosks where you can put posters. So if it's an invisible part in the center of downtown, of your downtown, then, and it's visible to people who are walking by, of course, obviously in COVID-19 times, no one's walking anywhere, but in normal times, which we hope to return to shortly, then that kind of visibility helps reinforce the sign, especially if you're being careful about using the same branding. So if someone sees a sign on a neighbor's lawn and then they walk by and they see a similar brand message on a poster somewhere in town, and then they get an email from a friend that says, hey, I'm part of this program, I think you should sign up too. We find that to be really effective in getting the 100% opt-up programs running. And we've now done 2 in Brookline, and we have over 850 people who've subscribed through various means to the opt-up, and we're really, really happy and proud of that. It has taken a lot of work, but we will keep going with getting people to opt up because it makes a difference in our individual carbon footprints, but also it sends a message to our municipal government, but also the state government, that people are interested in taking care of the climate issue and really increasing our electricity towards the renewable side and less to the fossil fuel side. That answer question? Do you have any others, Larry, that you wanted to address?
No, Daria, that was good. I think we're all set. People can send more, and we'll try to address those before it's over.
Great. So let's say we've convinced you this is a great thing and you've decided to bring green municipal aggregation to your city or town. What are the steps that you should take? So this is coming from our experience of what we've done that we think works really well to guide the process forward. So step one is to learn as much as you can about aggregation. You could read our GMA report. That's at greenenergyconsumers.org/aggregation. Attending the webinar that as you're doing right now is perfect. You can also share the recording with others so they can build up their knowledge on aggregation. Forming an aggregation committee is really helpful for, especially if you're able to bring different groups in town from different parties and bring them together to focus on this aggregation is really helpful because then you have more reach. Authorizing aggregation, I mentioned this when we were talking about the structure of aggregation programs. So if you're a city, it's a city council resolution, and if you're a town, it's a warrant article at your town meeting. Then once the aggregation has been approved, you're allowed to go explore it. You hire an energy broker. Make sure you look for one that has a deep experience in green municipal aggregations, in running these programs smoothly with green content in Massachusetts. Then with the broker, you create an aggregation plan with a review process. Then you tell the community about the aggregation. Then you go through and this can almost happen simultaneously to reaching out to your community. You go through the regulatory approval process. As I mentioned, the Department of Public Utilities has increased their processing time of aggregations. We're hoping they'll bring that process time back down, but right now it's over a year. And then once you've been approved by the DPU, the broker will procure electricity. And so what Good Energy does, they have companies that they work with that they've vetted. They'll let them know that so-and-so municipality is going out for aggregation and the different specs that are involved with that. And then these companies will bid on your electricity. And it's through that bidding process that can really help get a good price. When you have competition, in this case, that works to create a better outcome. Once you have secured your physical electricity and we are ready to provide you your renewable electricity, then the enrollment announcement goes out. There's a 30-day opt-out period that is required by the DPU. So in that case, if you have any naysayers in town who just do not want to do this at all and don't want the government telling them, oh, anything, and there's lots of good reasons, not good reasons, there's lots of reasons that we hear of why people don't want to do it. This is their opportunity. They can opt out before ever even getting to the aggregation program. Most everyone is going to go into the default and be really, really happy that something is getting done on climate, something really substantial and impactful. And then once your program is rolling, the only thing your aggregation group has to really do is monitor the program, make sure there's still a good understanding of what the program is and that part doesn't slip away. And then, so keeping that education process going, and even having webinars like this that are short, maybe shorter because you don't go into as much detail, but just keeping the knowledge base going about that this is a really great thing, that we're changing the electricity mix in your town for the better, and that you're making an impact, and that this is potentially even providing a price savings. These are all good things, and keeping the town going with that. And then as I talked a lot about to the question that was asked about how to do the 100% opt-up, running an opt-up campaign once a year, twice a year, however much time you can apply to it, is really also really helpful, because it both increases the visibility of the program, but also creates those physical the physical signups that then lead to more renewable electricity being used, and then more greenhouse gas reductions for your town. So we come to the end of our program. I've posted my email here. You're welcome to reach out to me if you have any more questions, especially if you want to connect about bringing aggregation to your town. We can talk about kind of what the next steps are depending on where you are. And we're really glad that you joined us today. Really appreciate your time. If you have any more questions, we've answered a lot, but please type in more, and we're happy to answer. We have 10 minutes, give or take. Otherwise, please read the report, greenenergyconsumers.org/aggregation. It goes to a lot more depth about what aggregation is, the kind of benefits that are are attainable from the aggregation programs. And then also where we see aggregation going, how we see it expanding and how we see it growing in the next few years. So Larry, is there anything else you'd like to cover before we wrap up? I don't see any more questions.
No, folks, we can stay for another couple minutes if you have questions, but thank you for your time. I hope you're healthy. And, we're pretty excited that it takes a little bit of work to get your community engaged into aggregation, but it's when you look at the number of things that need to be done to meet our energy and climate goals, we think the payoff is outstanding in this area. And once you set it up, it ends up being the gift that keeps on giving it, and it kind of automates an increased amount of renewable energy. So if we can help you in any way, we're available. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Larry. And for anyone who was not here right at the beginning, I wanted to mention again that I will send out the recording of this webinar along with a PDF of the slides. So please keep an eye out for that. And we're so glad that you joined us today. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.